Well, thank you and good morning. I'd been a great fan of TED for a couple of years before I found out that the E actually stands for entertainment and not education. I was mortified. But I'm over it now, and I'm going to talk about education anyway. So, in all of the nationwide debate about our schools and student achievement, there are 2 points that we really should be focusing on. The first is that we need to have a real sense of urgency about how rapidly and profoundly the world is changing. I'm sure you're all familiar with Did You Know Shift Happens? That wonderful video clip by Carl Fish and Scott McCloud. And there's a slide in that goes, we're currently preparing students for jobs that don't exist yet, using technologies that haven't yet been invented in order to solve problems we don't even know are problems yet. Gosh, what a powerful wake-up call that is for all of us in education. The second point is that we shouldn't be focusing exclusively on how to improve our teachers and teaching. We ought to be talking about learners and learning, what real learning looks like, and how we can design our schools to support real learning. We ought to be talking about the all-round intellectual, social, and emotional development of our students, and not just their scores on this or that test. Now, as I was growing up, something I'm still working on actually, reliable factual information came in the form of the Encyclopedia Britannica, 32 volumes taking up about 10 feet of the bookshelf space and costing $1,400. In fact, my family could never afford one, and I'm sure that's why I'm still totally useless at things like the brain game. But kids today are growing up in the age of Wikipedia and Google, and they have more information available to them in a day than previous generations could access literally in years or even an entire lifetime. But to be able to navigate this ocean of information and not sink under the tons of rubbish that's also floating around in it, our students need critical thinking skills, right? Comparing, contrasting, analyzing, justifying, identifying bias, considering opposing points of view, and arriving at an informed and thoughtful position on complex topics. In fact, all the things our politicians don't seem able to do, right? But the challenge is that we're trapped in a paradigm of education from an earlier age, and it's a self-perpetuating system, which is dominated by those who've done rather well in it, and who, a bit like the prisoners in Plato's cave, can't actually imagine anything fundamentally different. Of course, we keep trying to reform the system, don't we? So we're currently beating up our teachers, and we're holding them even more accountable for student test scores. And we keep trying things that sound like they're new, like blending learning or flipping classrooms. But really, these are just different shades of lipstick on the same old pig. I searched for the oldest classroom that I could find. This one is 700 years old. The teacher seems to be reading aloud from a book. About a third of the class are paying attention, and they're all sitting at the front. A third might be paying attention, and the rest aren't listening to a word the teacher's saying, and they're all sitting at the back. So not so different from today, really, is it? Except no one's texting on their phone. I like the chap in the third row who's fast asleep. But you know, this is typical of a teacher-centered classroom. The teacher is the expert, the one with the knowledge, the sage on the stage who delivers the knowledge and information to the class in the form of a lecture. Now, it's an effective way of delivering information and ideas, and in a world in which, at that time at least, very few people had any other way of accessing information and knowledge. But it's still a really important part of the paradigm in our schools today. So let's fast forward 700 years and let's take a moment to admire the great progress we've made in classroom design. Or not. What was that? This is your old school? I'm sorry. Let's bring up a friendlier one. Friendlier, but actually not significantly different. These are both teacher-centered classrooms. And if you look at the arrangement of the desks, you'll see another really important aspect of the paradigm, which is that we have made learning into an individual, rather private, and rather competitive activity. Of course, in real life, we interact with others, we work with others in teams, and we learn enormously from each other when we do so. Schools are not comfortable with that as a form of learning. They may even see it as cheating, because again, they treat learning as an individual mental activity. Now, what we see is when we let students work with other students on challenging and extended tasks with appropriate supervision, we actually tap into the social-emotional side of the student. This makes learning much more fun, much more engaging, and it opens up additional pathways of learning. Standardization is a key part of our paradigm. We want all of our students to do the same work and to progress at much the same pace in lockstep fashion. Standardization doesn't leave much scope for individual creativity or thinking outside of the box, does it? And all of these multiple choice tests are wonderfully easy for teachers or machines to mark, but they're terrible at assessing deeper learning. You know, it's often said that with so much standardization, we risk valuing only those things that we can measure instead of finding ways to measure the things that we truly value. As our kids get older, we separate the curriculum into the separate subjects, and we risk making the material really rather dry and abstract and boring. We risk turning off students who used to be eager and inquisitive. Of course, the real world is joined up, isn't it? Real life is multidisciplinary. Some of the big challenges facing our planet require a multidisciplinary understanding. And I think if you're a smart, brainy student in the traditional sense, you'll love the individual disciplines. If you work hard, you'll do well. And as Ken Robinson might say, you could even end up as a college professor. But the world is full of many young people with great potential who are not engaged by this approach and who don't want to be college professors. A speaker at a conference I was at some years ago said, "Too many of our schools are collections of classrooms rented out to individual teachers." And I think that's a brilliant observation. Teachers really value their professional autonomy. That's why so many of us become teachers. You close the classroom door, and for the next 50 minutes, you're the person in charge. You hope you're the person in charge. But really, we need our teachers to be members of collaborative teams, and we need our schools to be communities of learners and not just collections of classrooms. And we really do need to question this assumption that dividing every single school day up into separate blocks of time for the separate subjects taught in splendid isolation is still a relevant and appropriate way to educate our young people today. Our model can be so tedious that it only really works if you can command total compliance from your students. Of course, all of my classes used to look like this, right? But woe betide you if your students are not so compliant, and woe betide you as a student if you find the class boring, your seat uncomfortable, and your attention wandering. You risk being labeled as a problem and as somebody who requires intervention, sometimes even of a chemical nature, to help you to concentrate in our model. Over the last 2 decades, there's been wonderful research into the brain and how the brain functions. And we know that the brain is superbly equipped for learning when the conditions are right. So ordinary students with ordinary brains can achieve extraordinary learning if only we can engage them. But we really do need to throw out the sage on the stage approach, and we need to give our students opportunities to take responsibility for their own learning and let them develop the skills they need to become critical thinkers and lifelong learners, not just students working for grades. Our school at the moment is on a journey to create buildings which support student-centered, inquiry-based learning. And this is a concept that our architects, Canon Design, have worked on with us, which shows what our elementary school could look like in the future. Of course, I hope we'll have a few more students than this. And I do have enrollment forms with me, okay? But teachers still have their classrooms, but these open up into a large, multi-purpose, collaborative space which really creates opportunities for an intentional collision of disciplines. Hopefully not too many collisions of students, of course. But this is really a bold concept that goes quite a long way to addressing the concerns I've raised, and which really emphasizes that we should be educating kids for their future and not for our past. I'd like to finish with a quote from a remarkable social writer, Eric Hoffer. This quote is often used, so you may have seen it before, but I really think it captures the challenges that we face in designing learning for the 21st century. In times of change, learners will inherit the earth, while the learned will find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. Thank you.